The internal morphology of the brainstem. Just to note that all the buttons in this slideshow have been disabled for the purpose of this video. The brainstem consists of the midbrain, pons, and medulla. It serves as a link or conduit between the forebrain and spinal cord, transmitting motor and sensory information to or from the spinal cord. But the brainstem also is an important center for sensory and motor nuclei related to cranial nerves 3 through 12. Lastly, through its reticular formation, which we won't spend too much time with in this slideshow, the brainstem plays an important role in a number of visceral functions and contributes to maintenance of a state of consciousness. In this section, we'll be looking at representative sections of the brainstem, medulla, pons, and midbrain, for the purpose of being able to identify those respective sections based upon major sensory and motor pathways that we find in those sections, based upon the cranial nerve nuclei and that we see in those sections. And lastly, we want to look at the blood supply on a general basis of these brainstem levels. This section will be dealing with brainstem morphology. In order to accomplish that, we'll be looking at sections of the brainstem and examining gray matter and white matter features of 6 representative levels, one of a rostral level and one of a caudal level of each brainstem level, whether it be midbrain, pons, or medulla. This will be beneficial in order to identify in the future a section through the brainstem and be able to identify which level it is. And this then will be beneficial to be able to identify on clinical images. Looking at the caudal section of medulla, on its ventral surface we see prominent fiber tracts, the corticospinal tracts, which cause the surface feature known as the pyramid. As we go a little more dorsally, we see a small opening known as the central canal, which is a rostral extension of the central canal of the spinal cord, and is why we call this level also the closed medulla. And then dorsally, there are 2 prominent surface features, the gracilis tubercle and a cuneate tubercle. These are due to the underlying fascicles of these 2 regions, the fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus, and their respective nuclei. The central canal that we saw in the caudal medulla now opens up into a large space known as the 4th ventricle. This is the reason for the term open medulla. The 4th ventricle can be seen extending laterally through 2 openings known as the foramen luschka and communicating with the subarachnoid space. This is the course that the cerebrospinal fluid takes in order to get into the subarachnoid space. Ventrally, most ventrally, we see a prominent collection of fibers known as the Corticospinal Tract. This is a primary motor pathway, and its surface feature, the pyramid, is noted here on this section. Immediately dorsal to that, we see a very highly convoluted nucleus, the inferior olivary nucleus, and its surface feature is known as the olive. Dorsolaterally, we see another prominent collection of nerve fibers, the inferior cerebellar peduncle. And these are the 2 peduncles on each side that carry information from the medulla to the cerebellum and receives some information from the cerebellum. Here in this Quartal Ponds level, we continue to see the fourth ventricle. We see in addition now the add-on of the feature, the cerebellum at this level, just dorsal to the fourth ventricle. And we go more ventrally, we can see a fairly large collection of nuclear material, gray matter, that is, or the pontine nuclei, and those pontine nuclei send pontocerebellar axons to the cerebellum, forming the middle cerebellar peduncles. The corticospinal tract at this level is no longer a surface feature. It is buried in amongst the pontine nuclear gray matter. Also still present now at this level is the inferior cerebellar peduncle that we saw in the medullary levels, but now it's buried deep to the middle cerebellar peduncle. In the rostral pons, we continue to see the fourth ventricle dorsally. Ventrally, now we see the pontine nuclei and the pontocerebellar fibers are very dispersed, as well as the corticospinal tract. The pontocerebellar fibers continue to form the middle cerebellar peduncle laterally, carrying information to and from the cerebellum. Lastly, we see just dorsolateral to the fourth ventricle, another collection of nerve fibers that carry information to and from the midbrain. This is the superior cerebellar peduncle. Distinctive features of the caudal midbrain include the ventrally placed bundles of fibers known as the crura cerebri. These bundles are separated from each other by way of the interpeduncular fossa, a feature on the ventral surface of the midbrain. Just dorsal to the crura cerebri, we have some gray matter known as the substantia nigra. And we go more dorsally, we see that the fourth ventricle now is replaced by a small canal known as the cerebral aqueduct, and that connects the third ventricle with the fourth ventricle. Surrounding that is gray matter, known as the periaqueductal gray, and to either side of that we see two nuclear masses, the inferior collicular nuclei, and they are embraced by nerve fibers known as the lateral lemniscus. These two lateral features are part of the auditory pathway. In the central core of the this caudal midbrain area, we see some dark stained tissue. This is a bundle of nerve fibers that are crossing over or decussating, and they are part of the superior cerebellar peduncle, which link the midbrain with the cerebellum. The rostral midbrain has four features that are similar to or the same as those that we saw in the caudal midbrain, and they are the crura cerebri, substantia nigra, cerebral aqueduct, and periaqueductal gray. A new feature at this level is a nuclear mass, or masses, because it's bilateral, just dorsal to the substantia nigra, and that's known as the red nucleus. And also new at this level are two nuclear masses dorsal to this periaqueductal gray, and they are the superior collicular nuclei, and they are responsible for the surface feature on this level of the midbrain, the superior colliculus. Lastly, there's the midbrain level resembles a cartoon character, and do you know what that is? Well, it resembles Mickey Mouse if we invert the image as we see here. Now it's your turn to decide or pick out the various brainstem levels based upon features that were reviewed in the previous slides. I'll give you a moment to look at these. You'll be looking at gray matter and white matter features and whether there's a fourth ventricle or not, and that should assist you in being able to determine which level you're looking at. So here are the answers for those 6 sections. Hopefully you were able to get the correct answers. Just to review some main features here, the caudal and rostral midbrain levels. First of all, you can identify as midbrain levels because they have a crus cerebri, they have substantia nigra, and they have cerebral aqueduct and periaqueductal gray. But to distinguish the two, I think the caudal one is a feature that makes it different from the rostral one, is that you have a inferior corticular nucleus that is embraced by a lateral lemniscus, and then you have a central core of white matter, which is the decussation of the superior cerebellar peduncle that make it distinctive from that at rostral levels. Rostral levels, you do have a red nucleus. It's not as distinct as on this particular section as you may see it in some other specimens, but that's a distinctive feature of the rostral level. As far as the medulla is concerned, caudal versus rostral, I think one major feature is that you have a caudal, it's a closed medulla, rostrally, it's an open medulla. Secondly, at both medullary levels, you have a corticospinal tract, which forms a pyramid, quite distinctive at both levels. But the main feature being one is open, one's closed. And in the rostral medulla, you have an inferior olivary nucleus. That's very distinctive for the rostral medulla. Caudal medulla, you have a very distinctive nuclei, two distinctive nuclei dorsally, and they are the nucleus gracilis and cuneatus. As far as the pons is concerned, that may be the more confusing one that you may have trouble with, distinguishing rostral from caudal, but I think the main thing I would point out, in the caudal section, the corticospinal tract is still quite condensed, and it's embedded in those pontine nuclei, while rostrally it's more dispersed. That, I think, is the main key feature that you can see. There are certainly some other nuclei and other things in there, but I think that would be the main thing I would focus on. The next 4 sections will be looking at an overview of some components of the major sensory and motor pathways that will be dealt with in other slideshows. So we have a fasciculus gracilis and its corresponding nucleus, fasciculus cuneatus and its nucleus, an accessory cuneate nucleus, posterior spinocerebellar tract, the spinal tract and nucleus of 5, the medial lemniscus, and the ventral trigemothalamic tract, the spinothalamic tract or anterior lateral system, and the corticospinal tract. In this open medulla section, we have the spinal tract and nucleus of 5 again, the medial lemniscus, ventral trigemothalamic tract, the spinothalamic tract, and the corticospinal corticobulbar tracts. In this pontine level, we will be looking at the spinal tract and nucleus of 5, the medial lemniscus, the ventral trigemothalamic tract, the spinothalamic tract, and the corticospinal corticobulbar tracts. So the last section we're going to look at here is the midbrain, and here are the following sensory and motor pathways. The medial meniscus, the ventral trigeminal thalamic tract, the spinothalamic tract, and the corticospinal and corticobulbar tracts within the crus cerebri. This section concentrates on nuclei of cranial nerves found in the brainstem. These nuclei are organized into 6 discontinuous cell columns, 3 sensory and 3 motor. The general somatic afferent cell column deals with cranial nerves conducting general sensory information such as touch, pain, and proprioception. Special somatic afferent cell column deals with special senses of hearing and equilibrium. The general visceral afferent and special visceral afferent functions of cranial nerves are grouped into the same nuclear column. GVA deals with sensations from the viscera, such as the GI tract or the cardiovascular system, while the special visceral afferent portion of the column deals with the sense of taste. The general somatic efferent nuclear column has motor neurons that innervate skeletal muscles derived from somites, while the special visceral efferent cell column has motor neurons that innervate skeletal muscles derived from the pharyngeal arches. Cranial nerves 5, 7, 9, and 10 receive contributions from this column. Lastly, the general visceral efferent cell column is part of the autonomic nervous system and contains preganglionic parasympathetic neurons. Cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10 receive contributions from this column. Here the cranial nerve nuclear columns are depicted in a cartoon looking through the dorsal aspect of the brainstem. For clarity, the sensory columns are shown on the right and the motor columns on the left, although in reality they are all bilaterally found in the brainstem. Note which cranial nerves are related to each column, and that some of the cranial nerves are related to multiple columns. The next series of slides examines the cranial nerve cell columns in the 6 representative brainstem levels: caudal and rostral medulla, pons, and midbrain. Here in the caudal medulla, we see there are 5 cell columns present related to 3 cranial nerves. 1 for the hypoglossal nerve, 3 for the vagus nerve, and 1 for the 5th cranial nerve, or trigeminal. The cell columns in this rostral medullary level are similar to those that we saw in the caudal levels of the medulla. That is, there's 1 for the hypoglossal, 3 for the vagus nerve, and 1 for the trigeminal nerve. This rostral medullary section is near its junction with the pons. Visualized are 6 nuclear areas representing 3 cranial nerves. 3 are for the glossopharyngeal nerve, 1 for the trigeminal, and 2 for the vestibulocochlear, or cranial nerve number 8. Please note again that the structures are all found bilaterally. Moving on to the Quartal Ponds, we see there are 5 nuclear columns represented here servicing 3 cranial nerves. 1 for the cranial nerve number 6 at Busens, 3 for cranial nerve number 7, the facial, and one for cranial nerve number 5, the trigeminal. In the rostral pons, we lose the spinal tract and nucleus of 5, but gain 3 other nuclei related to the trigeminal nerve. One is part of the special visceral efferent cell column, and that is the motor nucleus of 5. And 2 are related to the general somatic afferent cell column, the principal sensory nucleus of 5 and the mesencephalic nucleus of 5. The root of the trigeminal nerve is divided into 2 parts, a portia minor, and that carries the motor portion of the trigeminal nerve, and the portia major carries the sensory component of the trigeminal nerve. In the caudal midbrain, we have the trochlear nucleus, which is part of the general somatic efferent cell column. Note that the trochlear nerve is the only cranial nerve at brainstem levels to decussate and exit on the dorsal surface of the brainstem. In the rostral midbrain, there are 2 nuclear columns represented servicing the oculomotor nerve. They are the oculomotor nucleus and the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, part of the GSE and GVE columns respectively. This slide allows one to get a general idea of what areas may be impacted if an arterial channel is occluded and how it may impact the brainstem. I'll give you a moment to look at this, and then I'll switch to the next slide. The following series of slides is a quiz to identify brainstem levels and the nuclei and fiber tracts within. I will give you about 15 seconds per slide for answering, but if you wish to have more time, you may pause the video to do so. Slide number 8 provides the answers. And here are the answers for those 7 slides that we just looked at. This is simply an index of all the slides we saw in the show related to features, internal features of the brainstem. The last bit of information deals with viewing axial or transverse diagnostic images of the brainstem and spinal cord. Typically, neuroanatomy texts that display the axial sections of these CNS levels with the ventral or anterior surface facing down, with the patient's left on your left and patient's right on your right. But axial or transverse diagnostic CT or MRI images are always viewed with the ventral or anterior surface of the patient facing up, and the patient's right is on your left and the patient's left is on your right. That would always also hold true if the brainstem or spinal cord was in view. The following 3 slides illustrates this point. So here we have an open medullary level section in a standard orientation that you would find in a textbook, and then below that the standard orientation for diagnostic images. And here we see an MRI section of this open medullary level showing the fourth ventricle, pyramid, corticospinal tract, which is responsible for the pyramid, and the inferior cerebellar peduncle. And here we have a caudal pontine level. Above we see the standard textbook view, and below what you would see in diagnostic images. And in this image of the Quartal Ponds, we can see the fourth ventricle, the corticospinal tract and the ventral portion of the pons, and you can know it's in the caudal region because it's highly compacted in this area, and the middle cerebellar peduncle is in view. And now we see the midbrain level above the standard orientation in the neuroanatomy text, and below the diagnostic image orientation. Here we see a midbrain in the Mickey Mouse view of the midbrain, and we can see in that diagnostic image, the MRI, we see a nice cerebral aqueduct, and the crus cerebri are clearly in view.